Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and I'm here today with a special guest, Professor Joseph Torigian. Professor Torigian is the assistant professor at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. He's teaching and his research focuses on China, Russia, Cold War, the elite politics, and foreign policy. It's the kind of mix that provides him with a really unique vantage point to analyze current events around the China-Russia dynamic amid the war in Ukraine and Chinese elite politics heading into the 20th Party Congress. Before we get further, very quickly, Professor Torigian's new book, Prestige, Manipulation and Coercion, Elite Power Struggles in the Soviet Union and China After Stalin and Mao. This is something that's on my reading list. It came out in April 2022. And I'm also eagerly awaiting his biography of Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping. And he discusses Xi Jinping in the paper that we're going to talk about today, which is something that he published for the Wilson Center. It's called Xi Jinping and Ideology. And I can't think of a better time to talk about this, like I said, heading into the 20th Party Congress. And with all the talk about redness returning to the front pages of the People's Daily and to people's lives in China. So Professor Torigian, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Right. Before we get on, I have another quick plug for Takshashila's courses. Our flagship GCPP courses, the admissions for those are currently open for the next batch, which begins in late August, September. So head on to our website, school.takshashila.org.in for all the details. You can learn advanced public policy, defense and foreign affairs, or technology policy. Pick your poison, and you can have a wonderful experience meeting thinkers and policymakers over a period of 3 months and pick up the basics of public policy. All right, Professor Torigian, let's begin today with, I'll begin with a sort of straightforward level setting question. Your paper essentially talks about the role of ideology in the politics of communist states. And it talks about essentially taking ideology seriously, but not necessarily drawing easy conclusions with regard to ideology as a guide to action. But let me begin with one of the terms that let's sort of go back to the initial idea of what exactly is ideology. In the paper, you say ideology is a term with many meanings and policymakers should be explicit about what they are talking about when they use the term. So what's the operative definition that you think is useful to think about the term ideology and its implications for what's happening in China today?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think that it begs the answer, which is whatever operative definition of ideology that you're using is the one question that you're trying to answer, right? So one of the basic points that I was trying to get across in the article, which is that there are so many different types of meaning that we have historically given to ideology that very often what happens is you see people talking past each other and that the term obscures more than it illuminates. So people sometimes use the term ideology as an insult. In fact, that may be the most historically common way of using it. So not really even so much as a social scientific term, but as a way of saying, oh, the other person can't be negotiated with precisely because they're ideological. Or the person can't see the objective real world because they're ideological and they only see it through those lenses. Now, other people have said, no, well, we can still use it as a term that's more than an insult that's useful, and then they talk about it, well, it can be a sort of legitimation strategy, a sort of narrative of what the regime tells its people to stay in power. It can essentially mean whether or not your views are cohesive, whether or not there's some correlation across a set of different positions that somehow make sense in context with one another. But, the danger also, I think, is that there is this temptation that if a country is ideological, that it's inherently easy to study precisely because then all you really need to do is read the definitive text and they're this sort of compass that allows you to guess exactly what's going to happen next. And that's not really an exaggeration. So, for example, one very famous American diplomat during the Cold War, whenever he was trying to get a point across, he would take off the collected works of Lenin from his bookshelf and knew exactly where the right page that he was trying to get across. And I think that kind of approach, even though you want to read those types of texts, can be problematic.
I presume a lot of people are today picking up the 4 volumes of Governance of China and doing something very similar where they're pointing to things. And there can be utility in doing that. And you talk about that in the paper. You sort of go through some of the writings of Xi Jinping and try and decode what are the influences that we have. I mean, I'll come to that later, but I want to sort of double down on this idea of, how do you think of ideology? Like you said, often it's sort of used as the antithesis to pragmatism. If one is fundamentally ideological, they're not necessarily pragmatic. When you're doing analysis, particularly to try and think of, how states act at the international states or at the international stage, or how leaders act at home. If studying ideology doesn't necessarily give you a sense of, that it's guiding action, firstly, is it a worthwhile activity therefore? Or is it better to, as sort of IR realists would say that, look at national interest, look at pragmatic interest, look at leaders as sort of rational actors and define clear sort of political interests and then look at actions. How do you see that interplay?
Yeah, as I was alluding to earlier, there is this temptation that everybody has to hope that they discover the taproot of some kind of social phenomena that will allow them to explain everything easily. And for realists, that's the international system. And for people who believe that ideas run the world, then it's ideology. And I think that when you really get deep into these events and you try to explain them, you recognize that you can't really approach the world from that kind of a methodological background, and that to explain any issue, you need to have a sort of eclectic approach, right? So when it comes to ideology and whether it actually explains something or not, well, first of all, we have to look at different times, different issues, what you mean by ideology, right? So for example, if we look at Stalin, right, and Norman Naimark has this wonderful a new book about Europe in the immediate post World War II period, he doesn't deny that Stalin was an ideological individual, and he describes all the ways in which he was. And indeed, his life was committed to the revolution. He saw the world from a class perspective. He wrote a history of the Soviet Union that was essentially a series of line struggles, which had to do with, a very Marxist dialectic approach to history. But when it came to actually predicting how Stalin would approach any single country in that period of great flexibility, he demonstrated this flexibility and pragmatism that was really, really, really quite powerful, right? And in fact, people who tried to find a Bolshevik code, which I talk about in the paper, one of the things that they realized was that, well, one of the things that's inherently Bolshevik is that you're very aggressive and you're very ambitious and you don't let any opportunity go to waste. And part of that is this struggle mindset, right? That you make the situation work for you even when things don't look great. But there's also been in the same set of literature, including Lenin's own writing, that always said that there is a leftist temptation to be more aggressive, proactive than the situation actually allows, which has been another sort of taboo and phobia in that same set of ideological scriptures.
In the paper, you quote this really fascinating piece of study that was done by the RAND Corporation by Nathan Leeds, where he talks about, if I've got this correct, where he talks about essentially latent homosexuality being the driver of Soviet Union's behavior. Historically, this is just something that off the top of my head. Historically, how much sort of, what are the sort of glaring examples of such kinds of assumptions that you've come across in your work, which have informed at least policy briefs or recommendations which may have gone to policymakers?
When you read documents from the US archives about Russia and China, the number of culturally essentialist claims that you see that, well, of course they did this because they're Russian, or because they did this because they're Chinese, really is something. But, Nathan Leeds is interesting, not just because he had such a big impact on thinking about Russian behavior and because his reasons for coming to those conclusions were the ones that you described, which, looking at now seems ridiculous. His historic role in the history of studying the role of ideas and ideology was quite important, right? So this guy Alexander George, who worked for Rand, wanted to sort of save the idea of a Bolshevik code, but get rid of the sort of bizarre elements that Nathan Leitz had attributed to it. And one of the things that he concluded was that to make the case that something is ideological, you can do one of two things. The first is what he called the congruence method, which is you look to see what they say, and then you look to see what they do. And if there's a correlation, then it suggests that they're doing what they're doing because of what they believe. Now, that has obvious methodological challenges, right? Because you're not actually tying with direct evidence those two independent variables, as you would say in political science. And so, they could have been saying those things for any kind of reasons that didn't actually have anything to do with their reasoning. So then he said, well, the other thing you can do is you can actually trace the decision making within the elite and see whether or not they're actually justifying to other people in private Politburo meetings or in their diaries or something like that. And if you see a more ideological tinge, then make that you can make that case better then. But we also, I think, came to the conclusion was that these are prisms through which they see the world, but you can't discount the importance of contingency, of politics, of a complicated situation where even a strong ideological bias doesn't provide the exact answer to, which requires you to look at a broader set of issues, including whether or not that person has these maybe stronger, maybe weaker versions of how they think the world works based on what on ideological perspective.
Right. I think that's a perfect time to sort of segue into Xi Jinping, and you present sort of a case study on Xi Jinping in the paper where you talk about how he didn't necessarily fit into any of the molds of what we would classify as a reformer, as a conservative. I mean, he occupied in some ways all of these different spaces. But before you sort of talk about Xi Jinping and how study of his sort of life tells us a little bit about the differences that can exist in terms of action as opposed to necessarily what what sort of essential ideology one may have, and that obviously can vary from time to time and space to space and issue to issue and occasion to occasion, which I guess is where sort of pragmatism comes into play. I just wanted to sort of you talk about sort of communist political language and a spectrum across this sort of categorizing problematic tendencies. Could you sort of give us a lay of the land in that sense? How does one, when one goes through these documents and these papers, how does one read what is leftism, who are rightists? And like you said earlier, that Soviet history was structured as a history of line struggle. What exactly is line struggle?
Yeah, so that's a really good segue into, I think, the answer to your question, which is in Chinese politics, they, after a power struggle is finished, almost invariably characterize what happened as a line struggle. And I think here we see the strong Stalinist influence because Stalin himself also had presented the history of the Soviet Union in exactly the same way. So why do they present it as line struggles? Well, I think a key reason for that is you want to present your victory in a way that makes you look legitimate and the other side as pathetic as possible. So there is a scholar named Fred Tevis who everyone should read if they're interested in elite politics. And his story, to a sort of dramatic extent as a scholar, was to show that understanding Chinese elite politics is a history of these line struggles of having defeated people who were either too leftist and radical or too rightist and therefore opportunist and unambitious enough, was that these were, as I said, just justifications after the fact that obscured what tended to be more about personal issues, people not getting along with each other, lack of trust, the inability for deputies to intuit what the chairman really wanted, differing views about historical legacies and personal antagonisms. And Fred Tevis said, well, actually, look, we got all of this, we got all of these stories kind of wrong, which suggests, as you were saying, questions about how we should interpret political language and what that means. And so for Xi Jinping, who you just referenced, this individual who was interesting for many reasons, other than the fact that he happened to have been Xi Jinping's father. And one of them is that he was a legend as a reformer, that lots of people saw him as a sort of consummate, pragmatist, flexible, humane wing within the CCP. But precisely because these are such disciplined organizations in which so much power is given to the top leader as their due, once that leader makes the decision, you don't really have a right to express a different approach to, whatever issue you're trying to address, which puts a huge gap on the ability for people to speak out what they really think.
In some ways, Xi Jinping did sort of, in the paper that you talk about, you do say that there were places where you could see different sorts of tendencies, right? And this was part of it is in the 80s where there is a churn happening within the party, where his outreach to sort of ethnic minorities, him sort of, there's a point of time in the paper where you talk about him looking at reform in South China. And he, at one point of time, when there are these people who talk to him about how people in Hong Kong would necessarily, they have legitimate reason to be unhappy with, being in the mainland and therefore people tend to go. He sort of lashes out at them. Yet he eventually understands and he absorbs the fact that look, there is some merit to what's being said here. Is that a time where one would say that discipline from the top was weak, which led to this sort of experimentation, Or is that a time where one would say that the line was of experimentation, where you sort of avoid the experiments, avoid the extremes, but you continue with some sort of experimentation, which created room for people to do these things?
Yeah, a few answers to that. So Xi Jinping was in power primarily during the 1950s and 1980s. And these were eras where the party prioritized co-optation, addressing grievances, as opposed persecution, tightening the nails, to use the communist expression. So, and this is also interesting in the sense that we talk about a Bolshevik code or there being something inherent to Leninist communist regimes because they're Leninist and communist, but they can show the sort of dramatic extent to which in different decades they can address political challenges in quite different ways. And in fact, by the end of the 1950s, a lot of policies with which Xi Jinping was associated with were condemned as being rightist and opportunist, and he was the target of those criticisms. And then in the 1980s, especially after Tiananmen Square, when, as you were saying, these sort of more soft line policies in Tibet and Xinjiang were rejected, and a softer atmosphere with regards to the United Front, both to non-CCP parties and intellectuals, was rejected. He was executing sort of that policy agenda, right? But what's also, I think, crucial to keep in mind too is that as many examples as we can raise of Xi Jinping behaving as a liberal or reformer, they have to be contextualized by those other examples that show that he was still a member of the Chinese Communist Party and would do things that we wouldn't associate with somebody who had those types of opinions that you just raised, right? So, for example, he did support the special economic zones, but he was very strongly opposed to the household responsibility system, which was, one of the key other innovations of the reform era. And although he believed that by addressing grievances and economic development, that you could deal with social challenges, both in the Han Center and in Tibet and Xinjiang, he also had a profound phobia of chaos. And he didn't think that protests should be normal or allowable. And when violence was used to resolve a situation, even in cases where he likely thought that that was not the correct approach, he towed the party line and supported the party line. And when it comes to Mao, Xi Jinping was somebody who believed that it was necessary to prevent another strong man leader from appearing. He didn't succeed because Deng became that strong man leader, but he also had a profound emotional attachment to Mao and would be furious when people criticized the memory of the chairman. So, but also as you said, he could change his mind, right? So he could learn something and become either more or less hardline, and so those are all ways I think that problematize this idea of there being these clearly differentiated lines or ideological factions within the CCP elite.
Yeah. And this is an interesting, I mean, what you just sort of described, the sort of the attributes and the sort of thought process of Xi Jinping in some ways, you can see sort of reflections of policies by Xi Jinping. Although maybe that's, I don't know if that's reading too much into it, but you can see some reflections of it. For example, I mean, in the paper you talk about how Mao once wrote in a white cloth and gave to Xi Jinping. He wrote towards the party's interests come first, and which is again interesting coming from Mao, given that he at some level he wanted to destroy the party structure it one way through the Cultural Revolution. And I presume he must have thought of it also in the context of the party's survival, that you need these sort of churns over a period of time. So it's also about how do you sort of not just think, both people may be coming from the same perspective that this is in the interest of the party, yet one of their views would be that organizational unity and hierarchy and process is far more important as opposed to the other who believes that some sort of systemic churn periodically is much more important to be able to maintain party purity. So while you may have the same end goal in some ways, your approaches to that may be very, very different, which may be driven by many other factors. But yeah, I'm going to come to Xi Jinping now. Like I said before, how much of his father's influence do you think one can see in Xi Jinping's policies? But even beyond that, what are the kinds of influences, personal and professional, that you think are reflected in what he's saying and what he's doing?
Well, first of all, the extent to which Xi Jinping did or did not affect his son Xi Jinping is a profoundly politicized question, right? What's so interesting is that we have a lot of material that shows how the liberal intelligentsia in Beijing were reacting to the early years of the Xi Jinping era. And we see them skeptical, actually, that Xi Jinping would turn out to be a hardliner precisely because of their memory and understanding of his father. And in fact, Li Rui, who used to be Mao Zedong's former secretary, was one of the leading figures within these pro-reform party elders and knew Xi Jinping. On his deathbed, he was telling people, how could Xi Jinping be the way that he is? I knew his father. I want you to go and figure out, how something like this could have ended up this way. So people have been declaring Xi Jinping to be an unfilial son, that he is not the son of Xi Jinping, but the grandson of Mao Zedong. But then on the other side of the political spectrum, we're seeing these discussions from the political propaganda apparatus of the party talking about how growing up in a revolutionary household, especially a strict one, which was actually the case. We know that this was, a very thrifty, a very disciplined household, that this had, instilled in Xi Jinping a belief in the party and the party's mission. What the actual truth is, I think we can only do conjecture, but for the sake of discussion, one thing I would say is that growing up, listening to your father talk about the revolution in this sort of, electric atmosphere probably would suggest to you that you don't want to be the person who sees the party collapse, right? And second, the very first article that Xi Jinping ever wrote for People's Daily, which was in 1985, I believe, it was about how the middle and young cadres should respect the elderly cadres. But that didn't mean executing exactly what had been done in the past, because that wasn't real respect, because you wanted to serve the party, which meant that you needed to continue to see problems as they came, which suggests to me that Xi Jinping probably isn't thinking about what he's doing as, fundamentally different from his father, because like his father, as you said, the party's interests come first. This was someone who was really fanatically devoted to the party his entire life, despite all of the suffering he went to, which went beyond many other party leaders. But that also Xi Jinping, I think, probably in his mind is flexible enough that, he doesn't have to think about his father having been wrong, or could have thought about his father experimenting, and those experiments, maybe not working out for the best, or that the situation is just fundamentally different. We don't know. We don't know the answers to those questions. In terms of other influences, well, he went to the August 1 school, which was, a school for other offspring of pioneers and cadres, although for that particular school, it was the military, where they would read textbooks that were titled literally Successor to the Revolution. He suffered greatly during the Cultural Revolution. It was a rough experience for Xi Jinping. This is somebody who saw his mother shouting at him at a party struggle session, someone who was detained in Beijing, and he told an interview in the 1980s that he thought he would die. He then became a sent down youth. He was exiled to the countryside in 1969, where he would have seen just how the utopia of the Cultural Revolution had failed abjectly in this very poor region. In fact, that's exactly what he said was the conclusions that he drew. And I think we have reason to believe that it's likely that someone like that in those situations would have drawn such conclusions. But at the other time, he would have seen other sent down youth, and also in the 80s, even after they had returned to the cities, sort of losing faith in the revolution, or wanting to make up for lost time, or becoming very materialistic. And he has always positioned himself as someone who had a different reaction to what he had experienced, and that precisely because his beliefs had been challenged, that they were strengthened, and that he rededicated himself to the party to prevent another cultural revolution from happening. So what I'm getting at is these are two shticks, which I talk about in the paper, that on the outside, for Westerners, might not seem like they make a lot of sense together, but throughout his entire career, his constantly return to this refrain about the dangers of radical policies, of the disaster that was the Cultural Revolution, but has all shown this really fundamental belief that to keep the regime in power, you need to think about conviction, you need to think about ideals, and you need to remind people that you don't join the party for your own benefit, but that this is sort of a historic force to which you sacrifice yourself. He's talked about this many, many, many times, for the people, that, this is, not a bureaucracy or a dinner club, but a revolutionary Leninist party.
Yeah, there's a certain sense of, I mean, reading through a lot of the material that that he's spoken about, that his speeches, his writings. There are a couple of things that I sort of take away, right? And I agree with you that I think that for all the last 2 years that we've heard, specifically this talk of him returning to sort of dogmatism and a certain degree of, Maoist style red revolution, particularly after common prosperity became such a big thing after August last year. There was this talk of, a return to sort of Maoist style, revolution. And there was that article, I think it was Lee Kwang Man's article, it was, the profound revolution, which got picked up in the Western press particularly. Yet at every point of time in official documents that we're seeing, what Xi Jinping repeatedly seems to be saying is that, we need to be sort of seeking truth from facts. We don't need to be becoming dogmatic. Of course, the bureaucratic interests don't necessarily always align with that, right? Because like you said, the structure is such that discipline and top-down enforcement is extremely important. And under Xi Jinping, that's been strengthened. So variations, and he also says the same thing to the cadres, right? That you don't distort central policies, you don't waver from them, you implement them as they are. So that sort of is in opposition to this idea that you don't have to be dogmatic, you need to be sort of experimenting. At the same time, he wants strict adherence to what he's doing. So there is a certain contradiction in how that's playing out on the. But the other thing that I also sense is that, and maybe this is just partly because he's a smart politician, is that there's a certain amount of, branding this current moment as new takeoff point, and that's smart political branding. But there also seems to be something to it in terms of the restructuring of the economy. There is something that he wants to do with it, which I'm not entirely sure he entirely knows what he wants to do with it. But because it's a difficult thing to tinker with without given this so many sort of sensitive parts and pieces that may impact stability. But there is a certain sense that there is a newness to this moment that he wants to sort of launch into. I mean, I wanted to get your thoughts on those ideas.
Yeah, on the newness of the moment and Xi Jinping's economic policies, let me mention another article by another leftist named Zhu Jiamu. So this is an interesting figure, right? So Zhu Jiamu used to be the secretary to Chunyun, and Chunyun and Xi Jinping fundamentally did not get along for a lot of reasons. But the father of Zhu Jiamu was a man named Zhu Lizhi, who led a purge in 1935 that Xi Jinping believed nearly killed him. But it seems that Zhu Jiamu has really had a big impact on how Xi Jinping thinks about periodization, because Zhu Jiamu was the person who had this idea that neither of the 30 years before or after reform and opening should be rejected, an idea to which Xi Jinping subscribes. But there was a very interesting article that Zhu Jiamu wrote in 2009, in which he said that a new era began in 2002 because Hu Jintao had decided that rapid economic growth needed to be looked at in another way, and that inequality and quality of growth needed to be something that the party kept a close eye on. And then in 2021, Zhu Jiamu wrote another article in which he said, I changed my mind. The new period didn't begin in 2002, it began in 2012.
How
right?
convenient.
And it wasn't because Xi Jinping had a new economic policy. It was because he executed this policy that Hu Jintao had identified better, right? And I think this gets back into this theme of, how Xi Jinping presents his ideological sort of superstructure of his views. And it's one that rejects the Cultural Revolution. It's one that affirms reform and opening, but that says that problems arise during reform and opening that only a stronger party with me as the core can address, right? So it's not rejecting reform and opening. It's saying that I can do reform and opening better, explicitly what they said, right? But also what the history resolution, as well as Zhu Jiamu, have these lines that suggest that what Xi Jinping is trying to achieve is sort of a middle path and a new path, right? One that doesn't make the mistakes of the Mao era, which were very serious, or doesn't fail to recognize these sort of practical problems that arose during reform and opening, right? So in terms of, common prosperity, this is a term that's not new, right? Xi Jinping used this term in the 1980s. Jiang Zemin used this term in the 1990s. And what's curious is whenever you see this term, there's usually also lots of qualifiers about how it's not populist. And we also, and, a lot of the problems that have been addressed as part of allegedly the Common Prosperity Program are problems that people, even that are not leftist, would say are things that needed to be addressed, sooner or later, maybe not in the sort of dramatic and destabilizing way that they were. But we also see that, especially as the economy is slowing down, that you can execute course corrections, you can be flexible, you can be pragmatic, and that even though you have this goal, over the long term, that doesn't mean that you need to shoot yourself in the foot by affecting policies that make it impossible for you to maintain, long-term stability. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there are policies that can achieve that, because these are pretty seriously structural issues that China focuses. But I don't think that Xi Jinping is the kind of person who, at least so far, because there were multiple Maos or maybe multiple Xi Jinpings, would approach it from such a dogmatic perspective that it would blow up the system.
Right. So you've anticipated somewhat my final question, which is, and I'm going to spare it down. In the paper, like you just said, Xi Jinping, in some ways, you see him as a consummate pragmatist, that he is sort of trying to tread a middle path of some kind. And on economic policy, I think you've just given us a very clear answer of what do you think is happening. How would you sort of look at that same the consummate pragmatist Xi Jinping and the zero COVID policy, which he seems to have stuck to somewhat rigidly? I mean, there have been some changes and some shifts, but it's still fairly rigid in terms of how it's implemented. Also, his foreign policy, particularly over the last few years, where there's been the sense that he's been okay with being far more assertive and aggressive, even if that is strategically damaging in terms of, quickening up this process of counterbalancing forces coming together. How do you see the pragmatist? How do you take that image of the pragmatist and sort of square the circle with these two policies?
Well, with regards to zero COVID, I'm not an expert in health policy, but I haven't seen a good sort of counter proposal other than zero COVID that would be able to meet China's immediate situation, right? So if your healthcare system can't handle the kind of numbers that would happen if you let zero COVID go, I don't know what the better answer would be, right? And if you don't have a full trust in your vaccine, and and vaccination rates aren't especially high, then you're faced with a challenge that I think anybody would have problem giving, a good answer to. And we have seen, over the last weeks and months that there is an understanding in Zhongnanhai that the economy is in trouble, and they're trying to figure out how you can address those challenges without going away from zero COVID. And probably there are some people who think that if you don't achieve zero COVID, the economy is not going to function very adequately anyways, right? But we don't know a lot about this thinking. In terms of foreign policy, well, first of all, a lot of people say that the ambitious grand strategy that we associate with Xi Jinping actually predated him, right? And a lot of the things that were already causing trouble were initiated by Hu Jintao. I think a lot of the problems that China is facing with the outside world are spin-offs of changes within the PRC. This is something that Bates Gill, argues in his new book, that when you do the kind of things that you're doing in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, inevitably that's going to affect how the world views you, right? And those are things that Xi Jinping probably feels that are just necessary costs because his top priority is regime stability. And I think in terms of, his poor relations, China's poor relations with so many other countries, I think a lot of it is structural, right? China is a rising power, and inevitably that's going to create tensions that can either be managed better or worse. So there's probably a limit to how well anybody could manage China's rise without causing those types of reactions. And it's probably the case that there's a sense that you push as far as you can go until there's a pushback. So the fact that countries are pushing back, is a problem, but it might not necessarily mean that the policy itself is inherently flawed. It just reached the point, as far as it could go. And it's possible that, we may see, course corrections and flexibility, in certain times in certain areas, especially, when the economy is challenged. How much you can do that when, your view of the world is increasingly that you're in an ideological struggle with the West that wants to achieve peaceful evolution. That's also a structural reason for there to be bad relations that isn't probably only something that Xi Jinping believes.
Fascinating. It reminds me of this analogy that Edward Luttwak gave in, I can't remember the title of the book, but he gives the analogy of China essentially being an elephant in an elevator, and the elephant is growing in size. And even if the elephant is not aggressive, it'll constrain the space for others. So there, in some ways, yes, there is a structural issue that is playing out. Thank you so much, Professor Torigian. This has been a fascinating conversation.
I thought so too, and thank you for your insights, and I had a lot of fun. Thanks for bringing me on.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.